The bitter wind rolled down the mountain like a beast on the prowl, biting into the flesh of anyone brave or desperate enough to wander into its path. Snow lay heavy on the ground, burying the last remnants of autumn under its ruthless weight. It was on such a night that a thin figure staggered down the muddy road leading to the timber cabin of a man who hadn't seen another soul for weeks. Her shawl, once white, was torn and gray with dirt, wrapped tightly around a bundle she clutched to her chest as though the world might rip it from her hands. Her boots were mismatched, one nearly falling apart, and her face was hollow with exhaustion. She whispered through chattering teeth, "Please, someone. Please," as she stumbled forward. Inside the cabin, the fire snapped and hissed. The men who lived there, a broad-shouldered figure with a grizzled beard and the hard stare of someone who had seen too much, rose from his chair when he heard the faint knock. His name was Elias. Folks called him the Mountain Man, because he'd lived alone for so long the town forgot what his voice sounded like. But when he opened the door, the night wind rushed in. And so did something that would change him forever. She fell to her knees in the snow, clutching the bundle tighter. "Please," she cried in a broken whisper, "please bury my child." Elias froze. The words hit him harder than the cold. He had seen death before, in wars, in blizzards, in lonely cabins when the fever took hold. But never had someone begged him like this. He stepped closer and saw the bundle clearly. It was a child. A little boy wrapped in a thin woolen blanket, his face pale as the snow around them. The woman's hands trembled as she held him up, as if offering him to the last bit of mercy left on earth. Elias bent down slowly, his large hands hovering over the child but not yet touching. "Ma'am," he muttered, his voice rough like gravel. "Come inside." She shook her head, tears freezing on her cheeks. "No, he's gone. He's been gone since yesterday. I couldn't dig the ground. It's too hard. I walked 3 miles. Please. Please, just bury him. Don't let the wolves take him." Her words cracked like thin ice. And something inside Elias cracked with them. He could have turned her away. He could have said it wasn't his burden. But Elias knew that kind of pain. Long ago, before he retreated into these mountains, he had held a tiny grave himself, had lowered a small box into frozen ground with trembling hands. That memory burned behind his stern expression as he lifted the woman gently to her feet. "You're not staying out here," he said firmly. She shook her head weakly, still clutching the boy. He didn't give her a choice. Elias scooped both her and the lifeless child into his arms and carried them into the cabin, kicking the door shut behind him as the wind howled. The warmth of the fire wrapped around them, but the cold in the woman's soul was deeper than any flame could melt. He set her down on a chair, brought a fur blanket around her shoulders, and carefully laid the child on the bed. For a long moment, the only sound was the crackling of wood. The woman's eyes were fixed on the boy's still face. She whispered, "His name was Thomas. He was all I had left." Elias swallowed hard, his throat tight. "Where's your people?" he asked. Her eyes flickered, and for a moment, pain turned to anger. "Gone. Fever took my husband. The fire took the house. The winter took everything else." Her voice shook, but her gaze was sharp with the strength of a mother who had survived hell. "But I'll not let the ground take my boy without someone to lay him down proper." Elias rose, grabbed his heavy coat, boots, and the old shovel that leaned against the wall. "I'll dig," he said. She stared at him, stunned. "In this cold? The ground's like iron." He met her gaze, and for the first time, she saw something fierce in his eyes. The kind of fierce that does not argue with death but looks it in the face and digs anyway. "I've done harder things," he said simply. Outside, the storm had grown crueler. But Elias stepped into it like a man walking into a fight he already knew he'd win. Snow slapped his face. The wind screamed in his ears. He walked to the clearing behind the cabin. the same place where his own small grave lay hidden under pine and snow, and began to dig. Each strike of the shovel echoed in the night. A dull, hard sound of iron meeting frozen ground. His breath came out in thick clouds, his hands numbing fast, but he didn't stop. He dug until sweat froze on his skin, until the shovel struck deeper and deeper. Hours passed like a slow prayer. Back in the cabin, the woman whispered to her son as if he could still hear her, brushing the hair from his forehead. "We're almost there, Thomas. Someone finally cares." When Elias returned, his face was white with frost, but his eyes burned bright with a strange fire. "It's ready," he rasped. She stood on shaking legs, clutching the boy, and followed him into the night. The wind didn't feel so cruel anymore. Maybe because for the first time in a long time, she wasn't facing it alone. Under the dark pines, Elias had carved a resting place that looked almost peaceful. He laid down a pine box he'd built years ago, the one meant for himself when his time came. Without a word, he lifted the child gently from her arms and placed him inside with the care of a father laying down his own. The woman sank to her knees, sobbing quietly as snowflakes melted on her lashes. "Thank you," she whispered. Elias knelt beside her, his big hand resting gently on her thin shoulder. "He'll sleep safe here," he said softly. They stood together in silence as Elias began to cover the box with earth, each shovelful slow and steady, like the beats of a heart that refused to give in to the cold. When the last bit of earth was laid, he took off his worn hat, bowed his head, and whispered a prayer he hadn't spoken since his own loss. The woman wrapped her arms around herself. But this time it wasn't to keep out the cold. It was to hold on to something new. Hope. A stranger had dug a grave for her child. But more than that, he had given her dignity back. Back inside the cabin, Elias poured her hot broth and stoked the fire high. She drank slowly, tears slipping silently down her face. "Why did you help me?" she asked finally, her voice small but honest. Elias stared into the fire, seeing another face there, a little girl he'd once buried, a life he'd once lost. "Because once someone didn't help me," he said. "And I swore if I ever saw that pain again, I wouldn't turn away." For the first time since her world had fallen apart, the woman managed a faint, trembling smile. The kind of smile that blooms not from joy but from the faint spark of survival. She looked around the small cabin, at the old tools, the wooden shelves, the scars on the floor, and realized this man had carried his own storms too. "What's your name?" she asked. "Elias," he said. "And yours?" "Margaret." Winter raged outside, but inside, something had shifted. She wasn't alone anymore. And neither was he. The mountain men who had sworn to live out his life in silence now had a reason to listen again. In the days that followed, he helped Margaret gather wood, showed her how to set traps, shared what little food he had, and in return, she mended his torn clothes and brought warmth back to the quiet cabin. Grief sat between them like an old friend, but slowly, it began to soften. One night, as they sat by the fire, Margaret whispered, "You gave my boy a place to rest. You gave me a place to live." Elias shook his head gently. "No. You gave this place a heartbeat again." Outside, the snow continued to fall, but it no longer felt like a threat. It felt like a blanket, heavy, yes, but not unbearable. And for the first time in years, when Elias closed his eyes, he didn't see only the grave of his daughter. He saw Thomas's resting place, a promise kept. He saw Margaret's face, tired but strong. He saw something he thought he'd lost long ago, purpose. The story of the poor widow and the mountain man spread through the valley like a whispered legend. Folks said the men who once spoke to no one was seen walking beside a woman with a quiet strength. Their steps slow but steady, like people who had both lost everything and found something back. And every winter after, a lantern would burn by the pine clearing, a soft golden light reminding every lost soul that even in the coldest nights, mercy can bloom like fire in the snow. So, dear listener, If you ever find yourself walking through a storm, remember Margaret. Remember Elias. And remember that one act of kindness can build a home out of broken hearts.